So I always remember when I was growing up, you playing songs in the car, and this was before internet, radio, and digital music and things like that. So it was just whatever was on the radio was what we heard, and we had cassette tapes. This was even before CDs. This was after 8 tracks. I didn't hear a lot of that, but cassette tapes and the radio were the 2 things that when you played music for me, you said, "This was my generation, this was music from my era." So you were also talking to me about you gave me a list of your favorite songs. So I wanted you to kinda talk about those. Billy Stewart, the Marvelettes, Dionne Warwick, and then Junior Walker.
I'm sure that when Ezra's old enough to understand all of this, these will be oldie oldies. When when I grew up, some of the songs I liked were oldies. So maybe it'll just be oldies, oldies, oldies when Ezra hears them. But I was, I guess I was into rhythm and blues, and that's what they called it back in the day. By the time that Ezra grows up, I'm sure that they may have another title for it, but it'll be rhythm and blues, oldies, oldies. Um, and most kids probably won't listen to it, but I've noticed your generation took these songs and they made them backgrounds to rap because you've sent me stuff that's really good. And I don't particularly like rap, uh, but that was your era. And then they took my era and put it in the background. So when I told you about these songs, you remembered them either from when you were a youngster, or you remember them because I sent them to you and said, "Hey, these are my favorite songs." Or sometimes I'll send you smooth jazz, and you'll say, "Hey, I heard that a certain rapper's doing that." Then you'll send me that. So when Ezra grows up, he'll be listening to music that probably you and I don't understand or maybe dislike. Who knows? But you might like it. But um, these were relatively conservative type music, um, in a black arena. I didn't listen to anything that was like, I didn't like Aretha Franklin, who was the queen of soul. But I didn't like that kind of music because it's a down south type of black music, and I just didn't like that. She's okay. I mean, I wouldn't turn her off, but um, the music wasn't my style. I was more into the Billy Stewart and the Marvelettes and the Four Tops, the Temptations, more the groups. Um, the songs were just different then, and they all told a story. Ezra goes back and he looks at the things that I liked. You'll see that most of these things they tell a story in the music. The rap music is a little beyond that to me. Um, they're telling stories, but they're telling them with cursing and a lot of violence. And I didn't like those kind of songs. I didn't like Otis Redding. Otis Redding was a big star. I just didn't like him. But mine was more on the conservative side, like you said, Billy Stewart, Marvelettes, um, Barbara Mason, Booker T, and the MGs. These were the kind of guys that I liked. Believe it or not, I don't like Kenny G. He just isn't my type. Um, I'm more Najee, and Ezra has to listen to Najee and some smooth jazz, and I'll send you a list, and maybe we could talk about smooth jazz. But it's totally different from soul music, and that's what they called it, rhythm and blues, soul music. But white people listen to it, and it to me it wasn't soul music. And I've heard um, white people who sound black, you know. So when you say black music, there's white musicians that were making music that were in the categories of the list that I sent you. But Music was different back in my days, and like I said, it was relatively nonviolent, no cursing, those kinds of things, and it was just kind of a black soul music, rhythm and blues. So
I
that's what I
noticed
like.
the list that you gave me, it was
Hmm.
between 1961 and 1965. So about a 5 year period of the 60s. And as I've gotten older, I've noticed, and I'm sure you probably notice this, about every 10 years, the music kind of changes of what is popular music and what is in at the time. And each decade has its own style and, the instrumentation that they're using. I'm starting to get to the point now where I was born in the 80s, and growing up in the 90s, I always thought, "Oh, the 80s music is so cool." But now I'm listening to it in 40 years later, and a lot of the 80s music, it has that the synthesizer was very popular at that time, and not actual instruments and orchestration and things. It was kinda like it felt like they were just playing around. They found a new toy, and here's what it sounds like. To me, when I listen to those songs now, a lot of them sound artificial. They don't sound like a classic song that is with a full orchestra or orchestration. And
Yeah,
so it's interesting that, like, I was listening to Michael Jackson the other day, and Quincy Jones produced a lot of his albums, all of his albums in the '80s, and he's somebody that comes from the background of a full big band and an orchestra. But
right.
even he was, on the Michael Jackson Thriller and the Bad album in particular, a lot of it is just synthesizer and not actual instruments. It's just, oh, this is what a computer thinks the instrument sounds like, and him just playing around with the sounds. So I just think that's interesting. Every 10 years, what is popular now, what's popular in 2020s, I'm not particularly enjoying like I did the sounds in the 2000s or even in the 2010s. So I just thought that was an interesting observation as I've gotten older and I have more experience listening to music in all the different decades. Those are things that stand out to me. So for you, with the 60s, is there something about that time period that you like in particular, or do you think it was just, "Oh, that was when I grew up, so that's why I like it"?
Yeah, you think about it, and it's good you put it in 10 years. You're right. It changes about every 10 years. It kind of cycles, and they add more, not automation, but all the tectronics that happen. And by the time that Ezra is old enough to understand all of this and he likes his own kind of music, it'll be into the AI. And that's where we are now, where they're using people's voices from way back. And Michael Jackson's a perfect example. But as a musician, I had different views of artists, and all the stuff that you talk about is absolutely right. And what they do is they go in the studios and they make them sound good. But in reality, if you listen to them live, oh my goodness, some of these singers were horrible, but they were good enough, and their voice was different. I'm trying to think of you remember this, Trent, the guy that Michael Jackson, he helped produce his record, and it was a one hit
Oh,
wonder,
yeah,
and that
Rockwell.
Rockwell. Remember
Yeah,
that song?
yeah.
And
I still listen to that to this day, but it's only for Michael Jackson, it's not for Rockwell.
right, right. But that's probably the one of the best examples that you and I understand of how they went in, and they, even had Michael Jackson on the track where he was singing with Rockwell. And the tectronics of the time made him sound good. Your mother and I went to a concert um, in San Francisco. I'm trying to think of the artist now. My mind's just blank. And it's a she, and she's really a good artist. But her voice was so good, um, that I got goose pimples. But I've heard other artists live, and it's like I could do better than that, because they didn't have the tectronics in the background and how they mix the songs and, how they make the artist sound. But back in my day, that's what I'm saying, that those songs that those people sang, and like Billy Stewart, he wrote his own music. He sang jazz. He did rhythm and blues. He could do anything, and that's how good those artists were back in the day. Nowadays, it's way different. I'm sure there's some of them that really have great voices, but the electronics make the fakes sound so good, you know. But go to a live concert and listen to some of those guys, and they're terrible. Junior Walker and All Stars. Junior Walker wasn't even a singer. They were recording a track, and the singer didn't show up. So Junior Walker just improvised because they could put the singer in later. Junior Walker sounds so good that they just decided to just go with the album with him. But that was a good example of how good these guys were back in the day. They could do everything. The guy, you think he played saxophone? He was a drummer. He could play piano. He could play guitar. These guys were real artists. You look at the people now, and I'd say the majority of them, they don't do that anymore. Look at Prince. Prince makes an album. He plays every instrument on the album. I'm not crazy about Prince. That's not my kind of music, but the guy's a genius. His music is genius. Nobody can do what Prince did. So my day was more authentic artists, and I think that's another reason why that I like that music. And you say from 61 to 65, those are my high school years. So that was the time that, I was really getting into music. I played in a band and, played sax. So I noticed more artists and the quality that they produced. And so during my era, these were genuine musicians. Quincy Jones, you said he was with the big bands. A lot of guys came out of that and were playing rhythm and blues. They were bass players and guitar players. And Johnny Guitar Watson. Now, this guy had his own albums, and it was during the 70s. And he was really good, but not necessarily what I really liked. But I liked him because this guy was a musician. And if you look back in the days, and Ezra, maybe they'll come back with records again, vinyl records. They'll probably do something like that. When you look at the record album and you look at the musicians on the back, you'll see people like Johnny Guitar Watson, and it just blew my mind. I'm like, Johnny Guitar Watson, and he's playing with, some famous artists, but these guys are musicians. They were really into it. Today's people, a lot of them aren't that way. I'm not saying that all of them are not like the 60s guys, but probably the 60s, 70s through the 2000s, authentic guys that knew what the heck they're doing. And I guess, like I said, being a musician, that was one of the reasons why, and I still do like the music production of, my era. And if you want to, I've seen these things, which era do you like the most? I like that 61, 65 era.